Okay, here we go. We're going to review the majority of the Bible in just a few minutes. We're going to start right back where the Bible starts, in the beginning, the book of Genesis. Here we have a timeline that was put together many, many years ago by an Archbishop, James Ussher. And we're not really interested that we're at 4000 BC, 3500, 3000, but this is assuming that Christ came right at the meridian of time, within 4 years of the marker between BC and AD. And so going back, he's got it right at 4000 BC. Whether or not that's precisely the year isn't the point of this video, but we're going to go through the chronology as near as we can. So some of the main figures. We have Adam, and of course he had Abel and Cain, and Abel was killed, and then Seth is the one that carried on his patriarchal line. Now, we are going to add some LDS perspective in here. Notice I've circled up here, this is Adam on Diamond. And if this is just a little bit far out, zoomed out, we'll zoom in on a few of these so you can see. But I wanted to note something. Here's Enoch right here. Notice that Adam and Enoch are contemporaries, and that Enoch lives up a certain, like 65 years of his life, and then starts building the city of Enoch. Notice when Adam on Diamond happens, that everybody all the way down to Lamech, the father of Noah, is still alive. And we note that in D&C, 107, where we find out who ordained all these. Adam actually ordained all of these guys to the Melchizedek priesthood, or order after the order of the Son of God, except for Lamech. And Seth was the one that did that. So, interesting. Also, the city of Enoch was taken up just 4 years before the flood. So that is really good to know. So it was really close right then. So not 4 years before the flood. The flood is over here when Noah is 600 years old. 4 years before Noah is born. And Methuselah and Lamech, of course, were left for that purpose. These guys, I'm not sure. Anyway, so that was kind of nice. Adam, Enoch, Noah. Here's Noah right here. Now, once the flood happens, Shem, Ham, and Japheth all live beyond the flood. And Shem it's hypothesized that he is the one that is Melchizedek. There's some idea that it's him. It might not be. It could have been Arphaxad or Salah or some contemporary here. But Shem was a great high priest, and Melchizedek is known as a great high priest, and we name the priesthood after him. So if it wasn't him, it certainly could have been one of these other guys. But I want you to notice, here we have the descendancy all the way down to, we start with, so Abraham traveling all the way to Canaan and then to Egypt. We'll talk a little bit about that. Coming back into Canaan, Jacob, Isaac and Esau, Jacob and Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, and then Joseph and his 12 brothers being sold into Egypt, where they stay there for a while, and then the book of Exodus happens, and Moses comes out, and he brings them out, and then Joshua goes and conquers the land of Canaan, and then they have the reign of the judges. So that's kind of important, that during all this time, we don't have the house of Israel until the book of Exodus. We don't have the house of Israel as a nation. And Moses kind of solidifies them as a nation and leads them through the wilderness for 40 years. And Joshua takes over and they go in and start conquering the land of Canaan. We'll look at some of the location on maps a little bit later. They then go through several hundred years of judges. And this is where we get Ruth and Samson and Gideon and Deborah and Barak and all those guys. Well, after this, at the end, we get a prophet named Samuel. Samuel is allowed to by the Lord and says, hey, go ahead and give them a king. They want a king, go ahead and give it. They haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. And so we start from here on. This is where we really have the history of Israel take a detour from where it was before. They were kind of loosely associated tribes, and then Saul becomes a king and unifies them as a whole nation. He loses favor with God and gets replaced by David. David then, right there, David reigns for 40 years and passes it on to his son Solomon, who then reigns, but his son loses most of the kingdom. And so that's kind of where we're starting in the second half of the Old Testament, is we're starting right with Solomon. And so what's going to happen here is that we have the southern kingdom of Judah. That's great. And then we're going to have a northern kingdom. Do you see how this splits right here? Yeah. So we're going to have a split in the kingdoms. And so when we go to a map, we'll kind of talk about that and look at the cities that are involved in that. And so here we get a whole bunch of the prophets. This is really hard to read, but it's let's zoom in just a little. There we go. Now you can see it a little bit better. Here's the reign of Saul and David and Solomon. Let's mark that again if we can. There we go. There's the reign of Saul and David and Solomon. And notice here that we have 20 kings of southern kingdom of Judah. That's good. And then the northern kingdom. So there, the kingdom actually splits. It only remained the same for 3 kings, and we're only going to touch one of them. Then it's going to divide, and we have the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, and notice this: Nahum, Micah, Joel, Isaiah, Jonah, Hosea, Jeremiah, Daniel, Zephaniah, Habakkuk, Obadiah. All these books of the Old Testament, these prophecies, are the prophecies of northern kingdom that's going to be taken captive into Assyria, and then of course the southern kingdom eventually being taken captive into Babylon. Now they go into Babylon and then they come back, and they build a temple back here. So right in here is where Lehi and Nephi take off with their family before these guys head off to I guess Babylon. And so that's where the Book of Mormon starts. And then they're able to come back. They build up the Temple of Solomon again, and then that's the temple that stays there for quite some time. So, alrighty, that gives us a little bit of an overview. Let's go look at a map. So here we have the journeys of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So we already talked a little bit about what was going on beforehand. Melchizedek is still around, whoever that was, whether it was Shem or one of his sons or associates. Let's start with Abraham. Abraham starts clear over here, almost by the Persian Gulf. And you'll notice it follows this red line. I'll see if I can trace it in that color there, or close to that color. He starts, and he's sacrificed by his father, or almost given up to sacrifice. And so he is told, get out of here, go somewhere. And he goes up here to a place that he names Haran, which is his brother. It's great, and that's Lot's father. So we always talk about Abraham and his nephew Lot. Well, that's it. It's Abraham's brothers, and they named that place after that brother. But you can see that he comes down here, and he goes to a place called Shechem. That's where he starts. And then a place called Beth El, which means house of God. He builds an altar there. And now there's a little place called Hebron down here, kind of an important place. And then at the very tip, Beersheba. Now the reason I'm drawing this map, he heads over here to Egypt as well, and he teaches the Pharaoh of Egypt how to, all about astronomy, the stars, the planets. That's the Abraham 3, that's where we get the Kolob thing. That's pretty fun. So here, you'll notice that these brown lines right here are kind of a roadway going on. Now you'll notice out here in this grand nothingness, it was helpful to me to understand what is going on with the big brown thing out here and this green sort of, look at what they call it, a fertile crescent. See, Abraham didn't walk straight across there. This is a big, huge Arabian desert. It's horrible, but there is some fertile lands up between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, and then down along the coast here. And these roads, you'll notice how they're really thick. Yeah, if Egypt wanted to get up to Europe, they would go right through Israel. If Egypt wants to go over to Asia, Assyria, and fight a battle, they're going to come marching right through here. So there are a couple of roadways that go through here. One of them is right along the coast, and that's the International Highway. The other one is where you see all of these names that you kind of recognize from the Bible. This is along what's called the Road of the Patriarchs, and it's up on the top of the mountain range. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So Abraham goes down here and he kind of settles this land. Talk about Salem, that's where Melchizedek was. He was a great king of Salem, and Abraham met him and paid tithing to him. So that's fascinating that they were contemporaries. So notice that we also have the journey of Isaac. Isaac stays he's a homebody, he stays here. Jacob goes back up here to get married and then comes back down here, and you'll notice he's back here at a city called Shechem again. So we're going to go through some of these towns in the middle of Israel and kind of see what they were and why they're important to our story. But yeah, the Fertile Crescent extends all the way up and then around here, around this Arabian desert, and it kind of squishes all of the highways to go between countries in smack dab in the middle of Israel. So you have Egypt and Assyria and then all of the native folk fighting for these areas, and it gives us a good context for the Old Testament. Here is a map of Israel that I particularly like because it shows the geography that is so prevalent that we miss, really, when we're talking about Old Testament stuff. The highways that we mentioned, there's one that goes right along the coast right up here. Eventually hits a mountain and has to go over into this valley before it can continue up or head over to the west. This international highway in this land, Israel never totally conquered this in the reign of the judges. This is where the Philistines were in this area. Now, on the other hand, there's a road that goes right up the top of this ridge. But going between these two is really treacherous. These lands are so formidable. So once you get up here from the south, you can kind of head along the top of the ridge until you come back down and meet, and that's fine. But this is where we have all the cities of the Old Testament, Jerusalem and Bethel and Shechem and all these others, called the Way of the Patriarchs up here. And then, of course, there's you can stay out over here. That was the King's Highway way long ago. And then, of course, you can go in where the Jordan River is. But these are thousands of feet in elevation difference. And so the top of this roadway, this ridgeway, as a part of Jerusalem, is actually really, really important. So here are some of those major cities that I pointed out. I think they're important cities to know. And let's go through a little bit of the history of them. Notice that here's kind of the southern end. And then you take this, and this highway that goes up through the top of it, you can kind of see it, all those red dots up there. Yeah, Hebron down here, this is on the south end. Shechem is kind of on the north end. Shiloh, Bethel, Jerusalem, Bethlehem. You kind of recognize those names, but they're all up here on this ridge. To come from the west or to come from the east, you've got to ascend a huge, even treacherous mountain range. And so, yeah, when you look at Gath, you're like, oh, that's where Goliath was from. Yeah, he was down in the valley. The Philistines were right down here and never really conquered until much, much later in Israeli history. So let's talk about how these cities are kind of important and what's going to happen to them. First of all, Shechem. When Abraham came down, Shechem, in Genesis 12:6, this is the first place that Abraham visited. Then, later on, when Jacob went up and got his two wives, Leah and Rachel, fled from Esau, and then he comes back down, he buys land right around Shechem. And unfortunately, it is there that his daughter is defiled with the leaders of that city. And though he keeps the land, they move down south to Bethel. Okay, Genesis 37:14. Jacob and his sons are living down in Hebron, and Joseph heads up to Shechem to find them. They're not quite there. He has to go off to another close little town up here called Dothan, but that is from that city is where he is sold, taken down here, and then sold into Egypt as a slave. But Shechem is where he went to go find them. Fascinating. After the Israelites come in, take Jericho, and then start taking over the land, they go clear up here. There's a city I didn't mention, but it's Hatzor, clear up here in the top. At the very end of Joshua's life, he comes together in Shechem, and he says, guys, we are making a covenant to always follow the Lord, and he puts a huge stone up, a great big stone of covenant. And then Joseph, who was sold into Egypt, his bones are brought back and buried in Shechem. Fascinating. There's so much that goes on around that city. Okay, Bethel. Notice in Genesis 12, right after Abraham first hits Shechem, and then he comes down and he builds an altar, house of God. Now remember, at this time, the city of Salem, I should point out right here, the city of Salem, Jerusalem later, is run by a guy named Melchizedek, which means king of righteousness. And so the fact that Abraham built an altar here, house of God, and then settles kind of down here near Hebron, just kind of a little bit away from Jerusalem, but close enough that he knows and is associated with Melchizedek and pays tithing to him. That's important to know. Also, Genesis 28:19. This is when Jacob, again running away from Esau, comes up here, and this is where we get Jacob's ladder vision. So he sees the rungs, angels going up and down, and again, it's a stony, rocky place, and he makes that his place, and that's where he builds an altar, and he recognizes this is a very holy and sacred place. One final thing with Bethel, in Joshua 7-8, Joshua comes in down here. I don't know what the path actually was, but the first city they take is Jericho. Well, after they take Jericho, they head up here and get beaten in the city of Ai. And so Bethel and Hai, Hai, and other locations are right next to each other, and he gets whooped. It's terrible. He gets destroyed. He goes to the Lord, says, what was wrong? Lord says, somebody messed up when taking Jericho. You have a traitor in the camp who stole some goods. And Joshua goes and takes care of that. And then he goes and takes the city by subtlety. He goes and hides half of his army behind the city, draws the other half out, and then the first half comes in out of camouflage and takes the city. The smoke goes up from the city, and then both armies come out and crush the army of that city. Fascinating. They were right near this holy place, and God knew that they needed to be destroyed. And it's interesting how similar that is to the Book of Mormon, and you can't help but wonder if Captain Moroni, and Helaman, in using that same strategy to defeat the Lamanites during the wars, had read up on their Old Testament a little bit and knew about that. Anyway, kind of a fun thing. So, Jerusalem, yes, we talked about that. This was the home, Salem, King Melchizedek. When Abraham was there, it was a thriving king of peace because of what he was able to do there. And if you read this, Melchizedek didn't fail in his efforts. It says he obtained heaven, sought for the city of Enoch. What happened to him? I'm not sure, but doggone it, that kind of implies that when Isaac needed a wife or Jacob needed a wife, Abraham's call to bless all the children of the earth really was that, not to join him in that wonderful city. So he settled down in Hebron. All right, so Genesis 14:18. Same thing, just a summary of that Melchizedek was there. Joshua 10:1. Now, by the time Joshua comes back in, has destroyed Jericho and then has destroyed Ai right next to Bethel. Fascinating. Jerusalem is inhabited by Jebusites, and they are apostate, and they need to be destroyed, just like the rest of the country that have just done so much wickedness, so many abominations that God says it is time. They need to be gone. The king of Jerusalem at the time took the title Adonizedek. That's in Joshua 10:1. And Adonizedek means Lord of righteousness. And I can't help but think, I don't know, pure speculation, not really a seminary video, but yeah, to have Melchizedek build such a great city, king of righteousness, to have such a wicked people take on that name, Lord of righteousness, I can't help but think there's a little bit of blasphemy going on as well. And the irony of taking such an exalted name for the king of Jerusalem when it was needed to be captured and destroyed. And indeed Joshua does. He destroys that king, and he doesn't totally conquer the city. David does later on, and that's down here. When David becomes king of all of Israel, and is crowned king just on the south end of Jerusalem here, he takes the Jebusites. The Philistines try to take it back and really test David when he's first become king, and they try to come up here through one of these valleys, and they get repelled. They try a second time, and David said, the Lord says, David, go get them, but do it this way. He comes around here and hides and lets them pass so that they cannot flee back to the lowlands, and it ends, they come up clear up around here, and he's just able to beat up on them until they can find another way back down off of the mountains. So it's interesting, the warfare between the Philistines and these Canaanites down here and the Israelites that are up in the mountain country is almost guerrilla warfare for many of the years of the Judges. So fascinating stuff there. Okay, Hebron. Hebron is a holy site. In Genesis 23:19, we find out that it comes into being right next to a place called, I think it says Mamre, and he bought the field from Ephron the Hittite, and Mamre, I don't know how you say that, but anyway, he buys it so he can bury Sarah there, and then Isaac and Ishmael come back together and bury Abraham there. And then when Joseph is sold down into Egypt and Jacob goes with him and all their families, he says, please take me back up there and bury me with Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah, and that is where I buried Leah. And so that happens right there. So here we have that Abraham is buried there, Isaac is buried there, Rebekah, he didn't get to bury Rachel there, but he buried Leah there, and he's buried there. But then Joseph is buried up in Shechem. Joshua 14:14 tells us something really amazing. There were two people that survived the entire 40-year wandering in the wilderness and ended up being very instrumental when the Israelites took over. One of them was, of course, Joshua, who then did all the conquering. The other one is the other spy, Caleb. Joshua was from the tribe of Ephraim, and Caleb was from the tribe of Judah. Caleb went and asked Joshua in Joshua 14:14 and said, hey, could I get the land with Hebron in it? And so Judah was allotted this land down here with Hebron, and that was why. Caleb went and said, we've been faithful. I came and we spied out the land, and then we went 40 years in the wilderness. You and I, buddy, we're together. And so up here, Shiloh, this is where the tabernacle was set up after Joshua took in the land. And this is up where Ephraim and Manasseh, these were the tribes given to those guys. So the tribe of Joseph was up here, or the two tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. And then down here was the tribe of Judah. Fascinating. And so we have one thing. You'll notice here is where David made a capital of Israel in Jerusalem. Before that, he was actually king just over Judah for 7 years, and he was told by the Lord to make Hebron his capital while he was king of Judah. So Hebron is pretty important there as well. So, okay, good. I think that gives us an overview of the geography and some of those just important cities. And just note that they're all on this ridge route up here. That's an interesting thing. So to follow up, here's from our LDS maps the division of the 12 tribes. Now after Joshua took over the land, he came in here. You can see Jericho right there, and then Bethel. That was where he was his next stop, the city of Ai, and he took that down, and all of these guys. This is how the land was divided up. So you have some for Reuben and Gad and Manasseh on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And then you have all of these, some of them are clear up north. Hatzor was a huge city that they had to take care of. And later on, the judge Deborah had to go back up and wipe that place out again. They were getting a little big for their britches there. Zebulun and Naphtali are up there. Well, right down here, you'll notice Manasseh is where Shechem, and that's where Joseph was buried, and that's where that final resting stone of covenant from Joshua in Joshua 24 is. Here's the field of Ephraim. Deborah actually came from Ephraim. Here's Shiloh, where the tabernacle was set up. Here's Bethel, where the original altar was set up. Jerusalem, Bethlehem is there. There's Hebron. You see it's still kind of in the mountain. And then this is a well that Abraham built and kind of represents coming off of the mountain. And that's really the southern part down there. So it's kind of interesting to note. Here are the 12 tribes. Now notice, boundary between Judah and northern Israel after 950 BC. So when it started to split between the two kingdoms, I mentioned that in the timeline, this is kind of where it ended up splitting right here. And interesting, during the Judges, Samson, who fought the Philistines, oh look, there's Gath right there, Samson was of the tribe of Dan. And the judges came from all different tribes, and the tribe of Dan was right here so he could take down the Philistines. That was kind of nice. Benjamin was almost slaughtered at the end of the book of Judges. Smallest tribe, once they didn't help protect. It's a long story. They didn't help protect, and all. There was a civil war, and the other tribes came down and almost wiped him out. And so when Saul, the first king, was called, he was actually a Benjamite. And so right up here north of Jerusalem, a little place called Gibeon is where he kind of made his home. And then David was from Judah. And that is the line of kings that follows all the way down to Christ. So Judah being the king there. And the final map we want to look at to catch us up to where we need to be. The empire of David and Solomon. So once Saul started conquering everything, see, you'll notice he had a lot to conquer. You've got this little bit here, and then Saul started conquering, and he did a lot. Notice where the purple goes. Yeah, he actually conquered quite a bit. David started going like crazy, was able to really be supported by the Lord through years and years and years. But you'll notice he didn't quite get all the Philistines taken care of. The Phoenicians up here. But he was able to put garrisons all through this area and subject these people and go clear down into the Red Sea down here and get a port. So Solomon had a huge, nice country with peace on every side. So when we start and talk about Solomon, that's where we're led to, is that Israel is doing amazing. David and Goliath has just nailed it. He fell and committed adultery with Bathsheba, killed or had her husband killed, fell out of favor with the Lord, tried to repent right away quick. The child from David and Bathsheba died, but those two had another child, and it was Solomon. And yeah, he got to start to reign over a huge thing, and one of his first assignments that he was able to do is to build a temple, which instead of being up here at Shiloh, he started building the temple at Jerusalem. So David had actually brought Ark of the Covenant down closer to Jerusalem and eventually had it sitting in the city of David just south of Jerusalem there. All right, great.